Gather round, everyone, for the air you breathe and the ground you stand on were not always so steady. You believe the world to be a finished map, a settled object? You might be inclined to think so, but not even a century ago, the heavens themselves were being rewritten like a messy ledger. They call it the Second Sundering, but for those of us who lived through the tremors, it felt like the end times had arrived for us all. 19,000 years ago, a moon elf named Eliandrith of the ancient kingdom of Olishar had foretold a prophecy concerning these very events. When the trials begin, in soul-torn solitude despairing, the hunter waits alone. The companions emerge from fast-bound ties of fate, uniting against a common foe. When the shadows descend, in hell-sworn covenant unswerving, the blighted brothers hunt, and the God-born appears, in rose-blessed Abeir-Toril, arising to loose the godly spark. When the harvest time comes, in hate-fueled mission grim unbending, the shadowed reapers search, the adversary strives, with fiend-wrought enemies opposing the twisting devil's schemes. When the tempest is born, as storm-tossed waters rise uncaring, the promised hope still shines, and the reaver takes hold of dawn-born chosen's fate, pursuing the light across the sea. When the battle is lost, through quake-tossed battlefields unwitting, the seasoned legions march, but the sentinel flees, with once proud royalty, protecting devotion's fragile heart. When the ending draws near, with ice-locked stars above unmoving, the threefold threats await, and the herald proclaims, in war-wrecked misery, announcing the dying of an age. Now I've already told you of the spell plague, which, for the most part, ended nearly 100 years ago. But Mystra was still dead, and she wasn't the only deity planning for her resurrection. Around the same time, a young, merely mortal man named Cyric had slain the god of murder, Bhaal, and stolen his divine portfolio. But Bhaal had foreseen his death and had made plans in preparation. These plans were the Bhaal spawn, children born of Bhaal and the mortal women he threw himself upon. Years later, this plot was snuffed out by one of his own, a Bhaal spawn known as Abdul-Adrian, the ward of the wizard Gorion. At least, you would think that the plan was snuffed out. With one last remaining sibling, the two final Bhaal spawn faced each other in single combat, and while the victor is unclear, we know whoever it was became a bloody, ravenous, dangerous beast who was slain by a party of nearby adventurers. And although the monster was slain, now with all of Bhaal's children dead, his divine essence was able to return, and with Cyric imprisoned by the other gods due to causing the spell plague with Mystra's murder, Bhaal was able to reclaim his divine domain and title as Lord of Murder. But there was another figure watching from just behind the curtain. Ao the Overgod, the one who watches the Watchers. He had decided that the era of upheaval had gone on long enough. He didn't just want order, he wanted a permanent solution. So he began to tear apart the two worlds of Abeir-Toril, bit by bit. As the worlds began to shift, the gods were sent into a panic. They knew that when Ao had finished rewriting the tablets of fate to restore order to this world, their power would be locked in based on the followers that they had on the material plane. So they did what the gods do best. They used us. Suddenly, common men and women across the realms had started waking up with incredible, terrifying powers. They were chosen. A simple blacksmith in Cormyr might wake up with the strength of Helm. A thief in Luskan might find the shadow of Mask whispering in their ear. But it wasn't a gift. It was a draft. These chosen were thrust into a secret bloody war to prove whose god was the strongest of all before the celestial doors slammed shut. While some people knew that they had been chosen by the gods and granted special powers for some divine purpose, others had no idea why. Meanwhile, both Telemont Tanthul of Thultanthar and Saztam of Thay ordered their forces to capture any newly anointed chosen so that they could harvest their power for themselves. In Mulhorand, the appearance of the chosen allowed the old Mulhorandi pantheon to manifest again on Toril, and to come to the aid of their people, who had become second-class citizens in High Imaskar, and believed they had once more been enslaved by their ancient masters, the Imaskari. With the aid of the wizard Nezrem, the Mulhorandi started a rebellion. Now, some people believe that the events of the Second Sundering and other divine events are simply petty squabbles between the Faerunian pantheon. But oh, my friend, it is so much more than the Faerunian pantheon. The gods of Netheril, gods of the Drow, gods of the Orcs, gods of the Hells. Everyone was involved, including a party of adventurers consisting of Vaesen Kale, son of Erevis Kale, a former chosen of the god Mask, his companions Orson and Garrick, and the person they were being transported by, Drasek Riven, the current chosen of Mask. The god Mask had returned to the realms through his chosen, and acted to put an end to Shar's cycle of night. About a century before these events, she had ordered the opening of a planar rift to the plane of shadow over the city of Orgelin, to create a whirlpool of shadow stuff that would have allowed her to finally destroy Toril as her plans intended. Unfortunately for her, her plan failed due to being imprisoned by Mask, but she was slowly managing to tear a hole in the whirlpool, coming close to fulfilling her goal. However, the concerted efforts of Vaesen Kale, who wielded the power of a monitor, the Netherese god of the sun, and the returned Mask, closed the tear. The flying Netherese enclave of Sakors that rested on top of the maelstrom had crashed. The Netherese princes, Brennus Tanthul and Rivalan Tanthul, Shar's Nightseer, were killed by the falling city. Even though the shroud over Sembia remained, sunlight finally started to reach the surface through the cracks created by the destruction of Sakors. However, soon after, a series of unusual natural disasters hit Faerun, including an earthquake in Erebor, a plague of locusts in Am, and droughts in the southern lands, leading to receding sea levels and increasing conflict. Many of the chosen prisoners of Netheril freed themselves from the special prison with the aid of some harbor agents. Among them was Stead Whitehorn, a young boy who had been chosen by Lathander. Seeing as the Morning Lord had returned to the realms during this year, he tasked Stead with traveling across Faerun and announcing his return. During Stead's eventful travels, he attracted the attention of many foes, most notable among them the blue fire madness-affected god named Nobanyan, king and god of the beasts. He was subjugated by Malar, the god of hunting, and tasked with capturing the chosen of Lathander, but the power of the young boy managed to heal the lion god of the blue fire corruption. Grateful for his freedom, Nobanyan accompanied Stead on his path through the wilds of Gulthandor. Meanwhile, the new plan of Shar threatened to bring the Shadowfell into the realms via the Underchasm. A group of Chosens had banded together to put an end to this plan. Cleef Kenrick, chosen of the presumed dead god Helm, Lady Arietta Seasilver, chosen of Siamorphe, and Joelle Emmeline, chosen of Sune. Prince Edair Tanthul was slain in a battle against Cleef Kenrick. Lady Arietta and her companions convinced the primordial Grumbar to remain in the realms and block Shar's plan by filling the chasm with earth. And in the process, the Underchasm was filled to its former borders before the spell plague, thanks to a sacrifice by Joelle. At the same time, Helm returned to the realms due to the faith of his chosen Cleef. Lady Seasilver, by then Grand Duchess of Marsimber, and Cleef Kenrick then returned home. On Nidal, some places of Abeir that had been part of Toril in the last century, and vice versa, were restored to their original worlds. The old empire of Unther was finally returned to Toril by this process. While in Abeir, Unther had succumbed to the domination of the creatures native to their new world. However, a reincarnated Gilgaam had led his people against their new oppressors until their land was shifted back to Toril. Once there, Gilgaam immediately went against the Dragonborn of Timanther to take back all of Unther's ancestral land, starting the first Timanther-Unther War. The Untherite god Enlil also returned to Toril on Nightall, but he chose the Dragonborn as his new protégés instead of the Untherans, manifesting in the shape of one of them in the citadel city of Jarad Timar. It was Enlil who allowed most of Timanther to remain in Toril, stopping the magic of the Sundering to some degree. Only the northern portion of Timanther was sent to Abeir, and the Dragonborn nation was consequently reduced to its southern territories around the Alember Sea and the Ash Lake. And while the Chosen were fighting in the shadows, the world itself began to scream. The skies began to cry with the beginning of the Great Rain, an unceasing storm that darkened the skies and wrecked the entire Inner Sea region and spread to nearby lands. The seas returned in a tidal fury, drowning new coastal cities and restoring ancient ports that had been dry docks for a century. The lands began to shake, and massive floating earth-moat cities in the sky fell like stones falling down a hill. Entire nations like Mastika simply vanished. One night they were there, the next, there was only an empty ocean where they had stood. And lest we not forget the ghosts, not of any mortal men, but the gods, deities who had been mourned for 100 years. The Lady of Mysteries, the Vigilant Guardian, even the Dark Prince of Murder. They crawled back into existence, reclaiming their thrones as if they had never left. If there was any good thing that came out of those three coming back, it was that at the very least, the return of Mystra meant the return of the Weave and the official end of the Spell Plague. But all was not yet done. Not until the year 1487 did the grinding of the worlds finally stop. Stars reportedly fell from the sky, gods long thought dead walked the land once again, and chosen-led armies clashed over the entirety of Faerun. The efforts of the Chosen of Asmodeus, Enlil, and Azoth resulted in the splitting of Asmodeus and Azoth once again, restored to their separate deific status. But there was one last conflict to resolve. A three-way conflict between Mystra and her Chosen, Larlok, the Shadow King, and Shar, the Mistress of Night. Larlok simply began his plot to become the new deity of magic, replacing Mystra in the process, while Shar and her Chosen had begun a plan to turn the Weave into a new Shadow Weave, intending to move the Shade Enclave to Cormanthar and use a ritual devised by Prince Drathren Tanthul. Meanwhile, Elminster Aumar, accompanied by Laerel and Illustrial Silverhand, had been hiding in the library of Candlekeep, attempting to restore the goddess Mystra and the Weave to their former glory. All parties converged over Myth Draenor. Larlok, the Netherese, and the Chosen of Mystra clashed in a catastrophic battle. As Tanthul began the draining ritual, his Netherese forces launched an attack on Myth Draenor, and Larlok attacked the Baelnorns to drain the ancient magic in their possession. During this battle, Prince Vatic Tanthul was slain by Dove Falconhand, who would then succumb to her own wounds, but not before having awakened the Baelnorns of the tombs of Myth Draenor to defend their city and people. The Srinshi herself appeared to fight for Myth Draenor, ordering the Baelnorns to protect the Tree of Souls, and sacrificed herself to wrestle the magic from both Tanthul and Larlok, then using the wards of Candlekeep and the Mythal to strengthen the Weave. The Chosen of Shar was defeated by Elminster Aumar in a mage duel, and the Netherese Enclave crashed atop Myth Draenor. Elminster himself was saved by Mystra, who regained full control over the Weave, stopping Shar from turning it into a new Shadow Weave. The survivors of Myth Draenor, among them Isvel Miritar and her consort Flar Starbrow, were rescued by the Srinshi before she disappeared and transported to Semberholm. Very few Shadowvars survived the fall of their city, but the ones who did became determined to preserve the surviving netherese in the realms. And as 1487 came to a close, the Second Sundering ended, with the full return of Mystra and the Weave, and the final separation of the worlds Abeir-Toril. The blue flames of the spell plague were finally snuffed, replaced by the steady, invisible pulse of the restored Weave. Magic had once again returned to sense. The sun rose on a world that looked remarkably like the one of our ancestors. Older, perhaps, and a bit more scarred, but still whole. Ao had recreated the Tablets of Fate, declaring that the gods would no longer walk among us mortal men so freely. The Second Sundering was finally over. The worlds were separate. We were left with our scars here in Toril, and they were left with their own in Abeir, as well as the stories behind them. We must remember that to a god like Ao, what matters most is balance, which means that the light must always be accompanied by the dark. And beware, friend. Though the gods are not among us anymore, they are still watching, and Ao still holds the pen. Thank you for tuning into this story, my friends. If you enjoyed, please like, comment, subscribe, do all those things that makes the algorithm like us. And if you have a story that you want me to tell, feel free to leave it in the comments below, and I'll get to it as soon as I can. There will be shorts related to all the names that you heard in this story that you may not be entirely familiar with coming out soon, or they're already out. My name is Sarah, this is the Tome of Many Tales, and I hope I'll see you for the next story. Bye-bye.